hub,
and spoke. Audio Collective.
Control is new from Commercial Type. Originally drawn for interview by Christian Schwartz and Miguel Reyes, this sans serif is designed for flexibility and can bring tasteful modernism or 70s tight-knot country exuberance to any layout. See Control and download a free trial version at commercialtype.com.
Can I let you in on a little secret? Mountain Gazette 202 is going to sell out probably before the holidays, which means that if you're listening to this, you've got a head start to go grab a copy. So head to mountaingazette.com/subscribe, grab a subscription, add the current issue, get our new cover designed by the wonderful magazine legend Harry Bliss. I think his Mountain Gazette cover is his best yet. Read what's inside. Enjoy the podcast while you're waiting for the magazine to arrive. Once again, that's mountaingazette.com. Thanks.
While many printers have shifted their focus, Freeport Press has remained committed to the art of print. For companies that need a printing partner for magazines, look no further than Freeport Press. We offer the capabilities a customer would expect from a national printer while offering the level of customer service clients expect from a family-owned business. Freeport Press. We do print, and we do it well.
freeportpress.com.
Adam goes to New York Magazine. Shockingly, he calls and says he wants me to be his photography director. And I couldn't believe that. I didn't even think Adam knew me. So I was like, are you sure you know who I am? And he was like, yes. Well, I'm very honored, but I don't know that what I do is what you need for New York Magazine. I'm not as commercial. I don't know that I have the right DNA to deliver what you're going to need for New York. He's like, no, that's what I want. I want art. I want a different New York. Don't think of the New York now as the New York we're going to make together.
This is Print is Dead, Long Live Print, a podcast about magazines and the people who made and make them. I'm Deborah Bishop.
I'm Karen Frank.
I'm Patrick Mitchell. Jody Quon's desk is immaculate. There's a lot there, but she knows exactly where everything is. It's like an image out of things organized neatly. She rarely swears or gets angry. In fact, she's one of the most temperate people in the office, maybe the most. She's often been referred to as a rock. She remembers every shoot and how much it costs to produce. She knows who needs work and who owes her favors. She's got the magazine schedule memorized and expects you to as well. She's probably got your schedule memorized too. She's usually one of the first in the office and last to leave. In fact, on the day she was scheduled to give birth to her first child, she came to work and put in a full day. When her water broke around 6 p.m., she called her husband to say, "It's time." I don't know if any of this is true, except the baby thing. That is true. Kathy Ryan told me so. I had a teacher in high school, Miss Trice. She was tough. I didn't much like her. She would often call me out for this or that. 40 years later, she's the only one I remember, and I remember her very fondly. In my career, I've often thought that the best managing editors, production directors, and photography directors were just like Miss Trice. These positions, more than any others, are what make magazines work. They're hard on you because they expect you to be as professional as you can be. They make you better. I see you, Claire, Jenn, Nate, Carol, and Sally. I suspect that a slew of Jody Quon's coworkers and collaborators feel that same way about her. Actually, I don't suspect. I know. I've heard it from all corners of the magazine business. I heard it again yesterday from her mentor and good friend, Kathy Ryan. She just has this work ethic, Ryan says. It's just incredible when you think about it. The ambition of some of the things they've done. And that has been happening right from the beginning. Ambition in the best sense, thinking big. And she's cool, always cool under pressure. We had a grand time working together. I still miss her. Jody Quon is one of those people who makes everybody around her better. That's what I believe. And after this conversation, you probably will too.
Jody, it is great to have you with us today. And I want to start with something very interesting that we learned about you when we spoke last week. Of all the amazing things in your life, and there are a lot that we learned from our conversation, we were really surprised to find out that you have not one, not two, but 3 Rolodexes on your desk. I can see them now behind you. And you told us that you use them still. You never throw out any cards and that you continue to add to them. So what we took away from that and what we know about you is you feel really strongly about the importance of making a call versus sending an email or texting. That's really a lost art, and would love to have you talk a little bit about that.
Sure. I feel that voice to voice is so much more powerful and so much more nuanced than what can be expressed in an email or certainly a text. And my typical method, and it's really the way I've been taught, is sending an initial message by email or just going straight to the phone. And I think that so often there's so much room for things to get lost in translation when you express something through the written word. But if you can pick up the phone and they can hear your voice, it can be very calming. It can be very reassuring. It can also be very convincing. And part of my job consistently for the last 30 odd years has been to convince people to do things that they generally don't want to do, or to be able to convince people to do things on our timeline, or to convince people to do 3 things as opposed to 1 thing, or turning a no into a yes, the art of the appeal, which is what we do all the time. And I think you have a greater shot at doing that if you can get them on the phone than if you're just reliant upon an email.
Easy to ignore those emails and texts.
Very easy to ignore. Even when I was in college, I would send a letter requesting the chance to be considered for an internship, and I would immediately build into the letter, I will call you within a week's time if I don't hear back from you. So I already build in the fact that they can expect a phone call from me. And that's what I try and impart to my team is let's not wait for them to just get back to us. Let's stay on top of them. I think you have to realize that people have very busy schedules and you just have to insert yourself if you want to get it done.
I heard from Roxanne specifically that you would take a card out of your Rolodex and just place it on her desk. And she was expected to follow up on that. And it would just be a landline that's on the card, nothing else.
That's great. All right, so we're going to stay old school. We're going to talk about growing up in Montreal.
I grew up in a suburb just outside of Montreal. Montreal is one of those cities that the suburb is not like living in Westchester vis-a-vis New York. My parents thought nothing of letting us go downtown. It was like a very easy thing. We had tons of magazine subscriptions and we had 2 newspaper subscriptions. There was the Montreal Gazette that arrived every morning, and then there was the Montreal Star that arrived every evening. And so between those 2 newspapers and then Time Magazine, Newsweek, Golf World, Sports Illustrated, probably a couple of others in there. We also had a television on at all times. The news was playing during breakfast. We ate dinner with the 6 o'clock news on. I grew up with CBS Sunday Morning and 60 Minutes. That was an event in our family. So I feel like I was exposed to a lot of news through different portals since a very young age. And I think that my parents always instilled in both of my brothers and I that it was important to be up on the news. That was important to be aware of current affairs. And also I was seeing fashion through the news. Like I was seeing fashion in the New York Times, the Sunday papers, styles, Bill Cunningham.
Were you a stylish kid?
I like to consider myself one. I certainly admired great style. When I turned 13, my godparents got me a subscription to French Marie Claire magazine, which was a really elegant magazine. And it was a big deal to get a Parisian subscription in my town. And so I'd be flipping the pages, and that's where I had exposure to European designers. And occasionally I would get my parents to help me pay for Harper's Bazaar magazine at the time. Another relative of mine got me a subscription to Mademoiselle magazine, which as a teenager, that was a really influential magazine for me because the readership was a little bit younger. It wasn't quite as sophisticated as the Harper's Bazaar reader. It just felt a little bit more attainable. And I would just rip out pages. I'd write down names of designers and I would write down names of stores. So I was like just obsessed with that. And one of the things I wanted to do was to intern for Giorgio Armani. I wrote a letter to Giorgio Armani. I sent it to Milan. I figured out where the corporate office was, and I was like, oh, if you could ever consider me one day for a job, I would work so hard for you.
How old are you at this
I'm
point?
probably 12 or 13. And my parents were always very encouraging. They felt that you couldn't know unless you tried, and that to try to do something is a very good thing, because even if you don't reach that destination, you are one step closer than if you didn't try.
You went on to study, no surprise, fashion design in RISD. And after that, you moved to Paris. You found yourself a place to live. You found work, all that at a tender young age of what, 21, 22? Yeah. So let's talk about Paris.
The first phase of Paris started when, in the fall of my junior year of college, during that winter session at RISD, you get a 6-week break. I decided that I would much prefer to see if I could get an internship in Paris as opposed to doing something in the garment district on 7th Avenue in New York. So in Montreal, Marité François Gerbeau had just opened a new store there, and it was the first time that Montreal would have this store imported from Paris. I happened to meet the manager of that store, and that manager expressed interest in me possibly going to Paris for 6 weeks. I would work for free. Is there any way that they could stitch together an internship for me? And they were delighted at the possibility of that, and they basically got it done. So my mother said, okay, but then you need a place to live. So they made living arrangements for me. The Montreal manager's apartment that he still had in Paris, that's where I would live. So I did that. It was a fantastic experience. It was my first time. It was my dream to go to Paris. I had 6 weeks of pure bliss. So when it came time for me to go to Paris after I graduated, I had that connection with Marité François Gerbeau. So I went back and worked for them basically as an intern again, an extension of my initial internship. And I found a place to live through friends of friends. We had 2 older roommates, 2 older gentlemen who were essentially like big brothers for me. So they really protected me. They were probably in their early 30s, and I was this young 22-year-old, and they were really loving towards me in the best possible way. Really a year of self-discovery for me, because I thought that I would arrive in Paris and that I would take Paris by storm. I was top of my class in apparel design, and I was just going to conquer Paris. The exact opposite happened. The job that I had with Marité François Gerbeau dried up after a few months. They didn't have any more need for me. They didn't have a full-time position to offer me, so I had to find another job. None of the design houses that I wanted to work with had anything available for me, none of the big labels. And so I found a job working for a much smaller designer. And while I respected her very much, I didn't love the work that she was doing. And I found myself not wanting to work as hard as I should. And I just wasn't inspired. So I quit after a couple of months. I had no energy. And frankly, I was not a very responsible young adult. I just quit. I didn't tell my parents. I stopped calling my parents back. My parents were livid with me. And I went through a little bit of a depression. I didn't know what to do with myself. I didn't want to call my parents because I didn't want to have to lie to them that I quit my job and that I wasn't working. I didn't want to tell them the truth, and I didn't want to lie to them. So I thought, oh, I'll just avoid them altogether. That was the wrong decision. It was a long winter for me, and I was just thinking through, what do I do? How do I figure this out? My brother came from Montreal to visit me. I told him what was happening. He said, you've got to call mom and dad. You have to. And eventually I did. One day I was riding my bicycle in the Marais near the Palais Royal, and I saw a sign, and it said Barney's, New York. And I said, oh, I know Barney's. I can work for Barney's. Let me knock on their door. So I get off my bike. I knock on their door. I'm like, do you need any help? I speak French and English. I could do whatever you need me to do. Because at that point, I realized that it's possible that I was not the designer that I thought I was going to be. It was the first realization that maybe I need to do something adjacent to fashion design, still in fashion, but not design proper. And Barney's was the first moment where I thought, oh, maybe there's room for me there. It's a small office, it's a buying office, and it's where all the New York buyers go to place their orders when they're on their overseas buying trips. And essentially, it's a beautiful office with a fax machine with a view of the Palais Royal. So I did it for a few months. 3 months later, they said, okay, thank you very much, but we actually found the experienced person we were looking for, and we don't need you anymore. And that's when I decided, okay, I've gave Paris my best shot. It's time for me to move back home.
So, Jody, I believe you met someone in Paris that shaped who you are today, and that was Marion Greenberg.
Right.
You told us that she really changed your life and she really taught you how to work. Can you talk a little bit about your relationship with her?
Marion met me at a time in my life when I was so confused about who I was. I had lost a job. I had no confidence in myself as a professional. School doesn't really teach you how to do that. She was actually the person that was running the Barney's Paris office. She was running it remotely from New York. And aside from running that office, she also represented very avant-garde designers, one of them being one of the designers that I respected very much, the same designer whose clothes I was wearing when she finally met me in the Paris office 1 week before I moved back to Montreal. She saw what I was wearing and she said, oh, is that Comme des Garçons? And I said, yes. She said, oh, you like Comme des Garçons? I said, yes, I love it. I've been wearing whatever I could afford of their clothes for years, and it would be my dream to work for them. She said, I do all their PR. Why don't you come to work for me in New York? So that's what happened. That is what brought me to New York. And the minute I got to Marion's office, I didn't even know what PR meant, but I soon found out. And I also found out that I knew nothing about what it meant to be a professional. And Marion taught me all of that. She taught me how to answer the phone, how to greet people professionally. We were communicating with Japan. We were the American press office for the headquarters in Japan. There's a 12-hour time change. So it meant that at the end of every business day, we were to send a very detailed, very formulated fax to Tokyo to give them all of the updates of the day. So it had to be clear. It had to be concise. It had to be clean and elegant. Everything had to look good and had to be very clear. We had to clean off our desks every night. There was a correct way to staple correspondence. There was a correct way to label something. There was a correct way to put a paperclip on something. Presentation was everything, which taught me so much because I learned through Marion that organization, that level of detail and organization is the baseline foundation to prepare you for the chaos that ultimately comes with big projects. And if you know where everything is at every moment, then you can do your job that much better. And that's what she taught me. One of my jobs was finding artists in America that would be interesting for this designer to collaborate with. So I would be doing all this research and updating Tokyo every single day and preparing these packages that I would ship once a week. And it was all about presentation. How do you make this make sense to a company in Japan that's seeing it for the first time? They have no time. So every time you unfold something or unwrap something, you have to put it in a certain order so it blossoms in just the right way so that everything starts to be cohesive to them. That's the kind of thing that school doesn't teach you. And I loved it. I loved my job working for them. I went to Paris twice a year, the city that I loved, and it was a great city to visit. Obviously, wasn't the right place for me to live in 4 years earlier, but it was still a dream to go visit. But ultimately, I felt that I had done what I needed to do there, and I wanted to actually work at the Costume Institute at the Met.
You were a kid who was really aware of fashion, and you've said that you worshiped Carrie Donovan, who was the iconic fashion editor at the Times when you were around this age. People remember her from those crazy Old Navy commercials, wild old lady with the giant glasses.
Yes, that was her chapter after the New York Times, after she retired. The New York Times magazine had a fashion supplement. It was called Fashions of the Times. It was basically what tea is now, but twice a year as opposed to 9 times or whatever the frequency of tea is at the moment. And Carrie Donovan was the fashion editor. Carrie also, before that, had worked under Deanna Freeland. She was part of that older, really legendary school of fashion editors. And Harold Coda and Richard Martin, who were then the curators of the Costume Institute at the Met, put me in touch with her because they were doing a 50th anniversary issue of the Fashions of the Times. And Carrie met Harold, and she needed a really hardworking photo researcher that could dig up the archives and get in touch with old photographers to get rights to pictures for this issue that they were going to be going to press within 6 months. And Harold and Richard thought of me, and they called me and they said, listen, we know you want to work at the Met. We can't hire you here, but we think you would be perfect working for Carrie. What do you think? And I said, I would love to. That would be my dream. So Carrie and I met. I got the job.
Was she as fun as she appears?
So fun. Every time I spoke with her, she had some crazy anecdote to share with me. And I was just like a sponge. I couldn't believe that I was face to face with this woman whose pages I had been oohing and ahhing over for so many years. It was thrilling for me. But the thing that Carrie Donovan said to me on the first day of my job there, which was in May of 1993, she said, okay, you're going to be doing research on this, and you're going to be exploring this. I'm going to be giving you pages, and you're going to be trying to find all those pictures. I want you to find books. I want you to go through tons of magazines. And then you're eventually going to meet with Kathy Ryan, who is the photo editor for the magazine. And she's the best photo editor in the world. And you should only be so lucky to be having this 1 hour meeting with her every week. So you're going to meet with her every Friday at 3, and you better be organized for that meeting. I was like, no problem. So I put my Marion Greenberg hat on, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to do all my work. And I knew that Kathy was so busy closing the weekly magazines on Fridays at 3 p.m. I knew that I definitely needed to be organized so that she could easily dip in and out of the photo research I was doing for an issue that was not going to be published for another 6 months. I just knew that her head was not going to be in that headspace. So how could I make it easy for her to dip in and out of that material? Long story short, the meetings were wonderful. I so looked forward to every Friday at 3. And I think Kathy did too. I think in the end, it was a nice break for her from the regular magazine. And we developed this lovely relationship over the course of the 6 months. And at the end of that 6-month period, Kathy realized that she had an opening in her department for a full-time photo editor. And she asked me if I would be interested in joining her team.
So you took a job at the New York Times Magazine, and you were there was Adam already there at that point?
Yes.
Okay, so you're with Adam and Janet Froelich, the great designer, episode 8 for our listeners, and Adam, episode 11.
And Kathy.
And Kathy Ryan, episode, I can't remember, season 2. But I have to say now, we're all of the same age, and we were well aware of those days when the 4 of you were at the Times Magazine. And Karen, I think I can speak for you and just say that Times Magazine was sort of the center of the magazine universe. And a lot of people thought it was unfair because you had the whole New York Times at your disposal and the reputation of the New York Times, and you could get anybody to work for you. But it was really the center of the magazine universe on all levels. Talk about being in the middle of all that.
It was thrilling for me. I will tell you, one thing that I realized very early on, like in my Paris days, right after graduating from college, was that it was important for me moving forward to work for companies that I admired. I knew that I would only be energized and do my best if I was working for people that I looked up to. If I didn't respect something wholly, then I was going to be bored. I wasn't going to do my very best work. So that's why I did what I did with Marion Greenberg. And that's why when I went to the New York Times Magazine to work with Carrie Donovan, it would be for Carrie Donovan. Little did I know that I would also package with that, be working with the best photo editor in the world, as Carrie said. When Kathy offered me the job, I didn't really even think that I was qualified to work for her. And I said to her, I don't know that you know really who I am. I was great for the fashion project, for Fashions of the Times. That worked out. But I know nothing about photojournalism. I know nothing about everything else that you do at the magazine. I'm really just like the fashion and art part of it. But I am not as intelligent as you might think I am. And Kathy said, no, I like the way you work and I appreciate that you're not immersed in the world of photojournalism, but that's okay. You can leave that to me. I like the way you work, and the way you work will find a good home in this department. I said, if you feel that way, that's fine. I just want to make sure you know who you're getting. And if it doesn't work out in 6 months, we can walk away. She said, no problem. I'd love to have you. And that was right when Adam started, the same time I started as well, coincidentally, except for those first 6 months, I was working on this fashion special. And what was happening there at that moment was that they were redesigning the magazine. Paula Scher had come in. She was working on the redesign. And Adam was such a left of center thinker, a very experimental magazine thinker, and injecting a kind of energy into the magazine that I think the magazine had not seen before. And I know Kathy has talked a lot about that kind of new energy that Adam was bringing in and the kinds of questions and the kinds of prompts he was giving her as she was even thinking about the photography assignments. So when I started 6 months later, the architecture of the magazine was changing. There was the Way We Live Now section in the front, and then there was a profile, and then there was a couple of features in the feature well, and then the style pages, the back of the book, we called it. And I remember it was forcing us to think about photography for portraiture. It was a really magical time. It was a time when Kathy started thinking about cross-pollinating, looking beyond the traditional boundaries of editorial photography, reaching out to fine artists. That's when she's calling Nan Golden. Lyle Ashton Harris makes his debut at the Whitney Biennial. And then all of a sudden, Lyle Ashton Harris's portraiture is making it into the magazine. The Times Square issue, Chuck Close is making these incredible 20 by 24 Polaroids in the magazine. We were breaking all the traditional magazine rules. And I think what was interesting about it is that, especially for me, I didn't come from the magazine world at all, but I did come from like art meets fashion. So that to me felt very natural to be thinking about contributors in this way. Also, Janet came from a fine art background. Both Janet and Kathy thought like artists, which not a lot of photography directors and art directors do. That was a unique situation. And I'm so glad that I was raised in that situation, because that's also how I think as well. I couldn't have survived. I couldn't have been as happy, I don't think, in a more traditional commercial magazine, because it was the New York Times magazine. We were allowed to, it just fell out of the paper. We could break rules. We could do whatever we wanted. And Adam was like, the more you broke them, the more you reinvented, the better. He wanted innovation.
We'll be right back.
Hi, this is Jeremy Leslie of Mag Culture. We're proud to support the Print is Dead podcast because we love magazines too. Visit magculture.com and see why print is far from over. It's just getting started. Read the journal for interviews and reviews, listen to our podcasts, visit our shop in London and online, and come to our live events in London and New York. We love magazines. Subscribe to our newsletter for weekly updates, all at magculture.com.
You just described that moment where the New York Times just elevated beyond where a lot of magazines have ever been.
If I could just add to that, you arrived there at that magical moment, which is amazing, but it also coincided with a little bit of a redirect in your life, because up until that point, you had pretty much been on a fashion adjacent road. And you said that you really found yourself at the Times, that it was really where you discovered what your life was going to be. And then came a time when Adam left and he went to New York Magazine and he offered you an opportunity there. How did you reckon with the idea of leaving this incredible place that you had found?
It was very hard. I was at the New York Times Magazine for 11 years, and every moment of those 11 years was extraordinary. We did so much together. I felt so blessed to be walking through those doors of the New York Times, going up to the 8th floor and walking into this sea of 50 or so brilliant editors, writers, thinkers. I never wanted to be found out. There was so much extra homework that I would have to do so that I was in the know. And I remember my first evaluation with Kathy and Adam. They were like, oh, we love what you're doing. You work too hard. I was like, no, I don't work too hard. I just have a little bit more catch up than most people do. But it was really magical. I didn't want to leave. I could have worked for Kathy forever.
you said, I think you're getting to this. I just think it was really interesting the way you said that Kathy gets a rush that I don't from this.
Yeah.
So that's all part of this picture of you identifying your own path.
Exactly. I loved every moment, but there was one thing that I noticed, and I would talk to my husband about it. I would say, I love my job. I love my job. I talk about it all the time. I tell you about every single assignment, but I look at Kathy every day. I sit right outside her office. And as much as I love my job, I do not have that same rush that I can see Kathy has every time she edits a story or gets a story thrown onto her plate. She lives and breathes it in a way that I almost do, but not quite. What's wrong with me? Why don't I love it as much as she does? And that really bothered me because I'd been there for 10 years. I was Kathy's deputy at that point, and I loved it. But why did I not feel as passionate as she did? Why was I not shrieking as loudly as she was when something amazing was happening in the layout? And I realized what it was, and I'll get to that. Adam goes to New York Magazine. Shockingly, he calls me and says he wants me to be his photography director at New York. And I couldn't believe that he had asked me, of all people. I didn't even think Adam knew me. I think he knew me, but he didn't know me. Like I never talked about photography in front of him. I never thought that I showed him who I was as a professional. I knew he knew Kathy and I knew he knew Janet, but I didn't think he knew me. I didn't think he knew who he was asking. So I was like, are you sure you know who I am? And he was like, yes. And I was like, but you're asking me to come with you to New York. I'm very honored, but I don't know that what I do is what you need for New York Magazine. New York is not the New York Times Magazine, and I'm artier. I'm a left of center thinker. I'm not as commercial as what New York is. I don't know that I have the right DNA to deliver what you're going to need for New York. He's like, no, that's what I want. I want art. I want a different New York. Don't think of the New York now as the New York we're going to make together. So I decided to take the job, and it was the hardest thing I had ever done. I remember telling Kathy, and we cried together. It was really hard to leave each other. We really worked so well together as a team. But I think ultimately Kathy was happy for me. I think she realized that it was an opportunity that I should exercise. And the person that she is, she accepted my resignation with grace.
So did something that Adam said make you feel like this was an opportunity where you would get this rush that Kathy gets?
It wasn't so much that. I mean, I was very nervous. I was like, okay, I'm going to try this. And I wasn't even thinking about the rush factor at that point. I was like, can I deliver what Adam wants? I know I'm going to learn from him. Will I be able to perform at that level? And I remember Jerry Maserati, who was at that time the editor of the New York Times Magazine. He said to me, Jody, you're going to be great, but promise me that you will voice your opinion. Make sure you do that on day one. And I looked at him and I said, okay. I promise I will. So when I got to New York Magazine, and it was the first issue, and Adam said, okay, we just decided what the cover's going to be, and you need to go shoot this person. They haven't signed on yet, so you need to call them, and hopefully you can convince them to sit for the picture, and we go to press on Thursday. I couldn't believe the new timeline, because at the Times Magazine, it wasn't quite that fast, even though it's a weekly. And I said, okay. And I managed to get the shoot done. Adam blessed the photographer, assigned it, made the pictures, happy with the pictures. I go to Adam's office with the pictures, and Adam says, okay, so what do you think? Which one should we go with? So that's the first moment. I'm like,
Let me call Kathy.
I wanted to call Kathy. No, I said, okay, I think this and this. It just all depends on what the headline is. He's like, good answer. Let's go down to Luke Heyman, who had just started as the design director. And Adam says, hey, Luke, Jody just got the pictures in and she thinks it should be this or this to try. I think she's right. Let's look at them. Can you throw them into the layout? Let's see how they look under the cover mat. Da, 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 da. And that was the moment where I was like, ah, that's my opinion that's being considered right now. And that was a really big deal. As the weeks progressed, and as I was like making experiments with assigning, and with Adam's encouragement, he was just so excited for the visual voice of that magazine to change. And so the more I could experiment, the bolder the difference, the better. So I was on fire and I was like, oh, let's do food like this. Let's do architecture like this. And let's just break the mold everywhere. And it was thrilling. And that's when the rush started to happen. The pictures would come in and the photo editors would come to me with their assignments. I'd be like, oh my God, look at these pictures.
All right, so here you are. You do go to New York and you join Adam Moss and Luke Heyman. And for the second time in your career, you're at the center of the magazine universe again. At the best designed, best edited, best vibing magazine around, the most interesting magazine in the world at its time. Are you aware of that when you're at the moment?
No, I will tell you, this is funny, but Adam would say to me and to either Luke at the time or Chris Dixon, who succeeded Luke, we just didn't know how to make a cover.
I've heard that before.
We do not know how to make a cover. I remember there was a George Lois exhibition at MoMA, and Adam's like, we're going to make a field trip. We're going to go look at those covers, the Esquire covers. And we went, and listen, I love those covers as much as everybody else does. But you realize not every cover was great. And that's what you realize when you're at a weekly. You can't, it's impossible to do a stellar cover every single time.
Not every cover story inspires a great cover.
Not every cover story inspires a great cover. And I will say that those years, I'd say 2004 to 2007 was a very experimental period in which we were trying to figure out what was our cover voice. I'm going to say that the first great cover that we did was the Elliot Spitzer Barbara Kruger cover. I think that was truly the first one. We hit some decent ones before, but that was, I think, the first real solid, memorable cover that people could actually talk about.
It's funny you mentioned Esquire because we had David Granger on, and I remember him saying, covers suck. They suck and they suck and they suck until they don't suck anymore. That's a universal issue in the magazine business.
Covers don't have to suck. I'm so happy that at a place like New York, we don't have like credits obligations. We don't have celebrity obligation. We can do whatever we want on the cover. We can be as nimble as we want. Some of us have learned with experience that we can be free to lean into a moment and take cover liberties. And we've done that. And that is something really special.
Jody, there have been so many memorable covers in your time at New York Magazine. Adam told us that we would have to get you to talk about the Hurricane Sandy cover. So let's start with that one.
2012, we knew that the hurricane was coming. The day after the hurricane, the offices were closed. We were flooded downtown. We were at Barrack Street. And we had a emergency meeting at the Wasserstein offices in Midtown. Bruce Wasserstein's company graciously allowed us to set up shop at their offices for the duration of the week because our offices were not functioning. Everything was transported to Midtown. Some of us went for an emergency meeting the day after the hurricane to decide what to do. Adam decided to rip up the contents of the feature well and devote it to coverage of the aftermath of the hurricane, and looked at me and said, let's assign original photography wherever you think best and cover it every which way. I was like, absolutely. My husband came to pick me up at the office that evening. We were driving along 7th Avenue. Midtown was not affected at all. Lights were on, business as usual. The minute you got to 34th Street, everything went black. And I couldn't believe it. The contrast was so stark from lights on to lights off. So I went into the office the next morning in Midtown and I was like, we have to get a helicopter up in the air right away. The only way to get the lights on, lights off is from an aerial photographer. I didn't even talk to Adam. I didn't want to even get into the budget with him. I was like, we just have to do it. The first photographer I called was in South America on assignment. He's like, I could do it on Friday. I'm like, no, I need to do it tonight because I don't know when the lights are going to get turned back on. So I call Quon Bond. He's this architectural photographer that does do work from a helicopter, and he's a vagabond. He's everywhere all of the time. He was in town because he was taking pictures at the Parish Art Museum, which was about to be unveiled. He had taken them from a helicopter. So he was like, yeah, I can do the assignment. My only marching orders to him were, Quon, the only thing you need to do is make sure you get the tip of the island in the picture. You've got to get the tip of the island. He's like, no problem. The next morning, Ewan delivers the pictures. He's like, "I was a little hard." I'm like, "Wait, what do you mean?" We're looking at them on the computer and Adam's looking over our shoulder. And it's crazy. We were like, oh my God, thank God this worked. The minute I saw the picture with the tip, I'm like, it worked. And Adam's like, that's a great picture. But it wasn't yet the obvious cover. And I got Ewan on the phone. I'm like, so Ewan, what happened? Tell me how you got this picture. I just thought he got the helicopter, he took the picture, and that was it. Didn't work like that. First of all, everything was flooded. So where we would normally charter a helicopter, which would be the 34th Street heliport, that was down because of the flooding. So because Ewan had been photographing the Parish Art Museum in the Hamptons, he had chartered a helicopter from East Hampton. So he called that heliport. Luckily, he knew about it. Secondly, when Ewan was anticipating the hurricane, he decided he might need to rent a car. So he reserved a car at LaGuardia. So he already had a car reserved. Thirdly, he anticipated that he might need cash. So he took out like $4,000 in cash. So what happened? The heliport here in Midtown was closed. He had to get to the heliport in East Hampton. He needed a car to get to the heliport in East Hampton. He had the car. He needed cash to pay for the helicopter because their credit card machines were down. The last thing is, which is unbelievable, it's like God wanted this picture to happen. The last thing is, remember I said you need the tip of the island. In order for Ewan to get the tip of the island, he has to be at a certain altitude in order to get the tip of the island up through the George Washington Bridge. That altitude is not normally allowed when there's regular air traffic. But that day, all commercial air traffic was down because airports were closed. The helicopter was given clearance to fly higher than they normally do in order for him to be able to get that perspective with the tip of the island. The icing on the cake is that when you're at that altitude in a moving helicopter with the wind, because it gets windy the higher you go, there's no camera that can get a picture in focus at that altitude, except for this Canon camera that he was one of, I think, 7 photographers in the world that had in his possession that was like new technology. And he was able to get a half a dozen frames in focus because he had this crazy camera. And that's how we got that picture.
That was an amazing story.
My best decision was to not bother Adam with the idea that we were doing this because he might have asked me how much it cost and I might have had to tell him because I probably didn't want to lie and he might have said no. So I'm glad I didn't ask.
You mentioned Barbara Kruger earlier. You've collaborated with her several times. Can you talk about what it's like working with her?
I've always been rooted in contemporary art and fashion. So I'd been following Barbara's work for a long time. And it was when Elliot Spitzer was outed when he was
governor at this point, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was governor. And it was so shocking. We had another cover story in the works. And again, Adam was like, let's lean into this moment. Who can we get to report on X, Y, and Z? And what do we do for a cover? So I thought of Barbara. I was like, this might be a moment. She's engaged in politics. And I thought that this would be something that she'd want to comment on. So I said, Adam, if you don't mind, I'm going to call Barbara. If you think it's a good idea, I'd like to call Barbara and see what kind of art piece she could make out of this news moment. And he's like, great. Yeah, I love that. Do you think she can work quickly? I called her right away. She responded immediately. And part of the thing I like to do in general, and this is something I learned early on, is rip the Band-Aid off. Don't labor over how are you going to ask the question? How are you going to make the pitch? The most important thing is make sure it's tight, make sure it's concise, just get the question out there and be as gracious as you can. And make sure that you say, I look forward to your prompt reply. And if you don't reply, I'm going to call you. Same thing. So Barbara teaches in LA. And so she's like, I love this. I can do this. What's your deadline? I was like, it'd be great to see a rough tomorrow. And then we're going to go to press the day after. She's like, what? Well, let me think about it. And she calls me back an hour later. She's like, I have this idea. And then she sends it through to me. And what we had done was we decided we would give her 3 portraits of Elliot Spitzer to respond to and see what she thought. And within an hour, she sent through this email and she took this photograph that I had given her by Henry Lutweiler and she put brain next to it. And it was brilliant. I ran it down to Adam's office and I was like, look. And he was like, oh my God, we have a cover.
Well, she didn't just put brain on it. You have to talk about the placement.
Right. She put the word brain and then the arrow pointing to his crotch, which was perfect. And it was the perfect image meets language, perfect commentary. What was especially great was that cover was going to be coming out on the following Monday. And the Elliot Spitzer story was dominating the news for the better part of that whole week. You were seeing his picture everywhere, so we barely even needed to put his name on the cover. The only language really was the governor and his fall, tiny, like little, and then the logo and brain. And that was like, oh, I think that's really the first great cover we ever did because it was meeting a news moment. It gets better with age. It just so succinctly gets this message across in this inventive and visceral way, and it reaches a very wide audience. You don't need to explain that cover.
And it gives you permission to go down that path.
It gives us permission to go down that path, which I love.
You've worked with her a few other times, including with the current former president. That was Barbara Kruger, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was in 2016. And this was a few weeks before the election, or maybe it was 2 weeks out from the election. And we thought we were going to be publishing what would be our final piece on Trump and his bid for the presidency.
It was the one on the newsstand when he won.
It was. And we had done several Trump covers before. It's like, what do we do now? And again, Adam gave me permission to call Barbara. I was like, Barbara, what would you do? What do you think? This is what the piece will be. And she said, I know what it is, Jody. And I'm like, what? She said, loser. I said, what? We can't call the election. She said, no, loser. And don't you get it, Jody? It's everything that he cannot be. It speaks to how infantile he is. And I'm like, oh my God, Barbara, you're brilliant. So I run down to Adam's office and he's like, okay, so what's the good word? I'm like, I just got off the phone with Barbara and I think she has a brilliant idea. And he's like, what's the idea? And I write it down because I don't want to say it. And he's absolutely not. That's going to be read like we're calling the election. I was like, no, let me explain. And he's, no, Jody, we just can't do that. This is Friday before the Friday that we're closing the magazine. So 1 week out. And he's like, I don't think so. I love Barbara, but I'm not sure she's right in this case. I don't think that we can put out a magazine like that. And then I go back to Barbara. I don't tell her what Adam said. And I'm like, can you just mock it up? Let's just look at it. So I gave her this great picture by Mark Peterson and she mocks it up over the weekend. I'm looking at it on Monday and I think on Tuesday, it looks really good. And I walk it down to Adam's office and I'm like, look at this. Doesn't this look good? Might you want to reconsider this? And he's like, maybe. I'm not going to say no to it altogether. I'll reconsider it. Then by Thursdays, I think we can consider this. And I had gone to a few other artists for other commissions as well, but they weren't quite as strong.
I was wondering if you were not putting all your eggs in that one basket. You can't.
No, I put 85 eggs in that basket, 85 out of 100. And then I had another contribution from another great artist, actually, Jonathan Horowitz. And that was the backup. And it became one of his famous pieces, actually, is Trump swinging a golf club into hell, essentially. So by Thursday night, Adams, we're going to do this cover. And then the Hillary email crisis hits. And all of a sudden, Friday at noon, it's, oh my God, what's going to happen? So Adams, we can't do this cover. We can't do the loser cover. And I'm like, Adam, but it's not calling the election. At that point, he's frustrated with me. He doesn't want to hear me say this one more time. He's like, let's see how the news plays out this afternoon. And it turned out that we didn't really think that much was going to come of it. Adam felt pretty confident. And by 6 o'clock, he made the decision to put that on the cover. We put it on the cover. It hits newsstands on Monday. It was thrilling, actually, because I don't think another magazine would have ever had the nerve to do that cover. And I felt so proud that I worked at a magazine that had the chutzpah to do this bold, reductive, just courageous cover in every sense of the word, and had the nerve to apply that language to him. And I remember on my Instagram, I wrote, the only magazine in the world that would do this. I'm so proud to work here. And then the election happens and he wins.
But I'm sure you got pushback from readers who said, why are you calling the election?
We did, but we also got encouragement from readers who were clapping for us at the same time. Ultimately, the best covers are the ones that are the most controversial. I think it's good to have discourse on both sides and fervor. I think that's important. It means the cover's doing something. If the cover's doing nothing, who cares?
We'll be right back.
Print is Dead is made possible by the support of the Society of Publication Designers. The SPD powers the future of visual storytelling, setting the standard for editorial excellence and shaping the future of visual culture. For more information, visit spd.org.
There are just so many incredible covers, and we are going to show as many as we can on our site. But another thing that Adam said to us is that you never, ever take no for an answer, and that you make the impossible happen. So in that spirit, I wonder if you can talk briefly about the Bert Stern, Marilyn Monroe reshoot with Lindsay Lohan.
That's something that we couldn't have predicted. In 2008, which was the year that New York would be celebrating their 40th anniversary, we had planned that every section of the magazine would pay tribute to 40 years and do something that referred back to 1968 over the course of the year in honor of the 40 years. I was really calling Bert Stern because I was thinking of the strategist section and the lookbook that we do there. We were thinking of turning the clock back on that section and making the whole thing feel like 1968, which is what we ended up doing. And I thought, oh, let me call a photographer from that era to make pictures for the lookbook. So I called Bert Stern. And I said, we'd never worked together before, but I had this idea. Would you mind shooting a lookbook with your specific lens harkening back to the 60s? He's, nah, I'm not interested in that. But what I am interested in is if you could get Lindsay Lohan for me, I would recreate Marilyn Monroe's last sitting with her if she would ever say yes. I was like, that's a great idea. So I asked Adam, what do you think of this? He's like, yeah, let's take it if she'll do it. So I called her publicist, and this is the only time this has ever happened. I said, we have this idea. Bert Stern, who famously did Marilyn Monroe's last sitting, he would love to do it with Lindsay Lohan. Do you think she'd be interested? I said, we'd have to do it exactly like the last sitting. She'd have to take her clothes off. She's like, let me call you back. She calls me back in 3 minutes. I've never gotten a call back this fast. Lindsay would love to do it. When can we do it? She's available. I was like, what? I call Bert back. I'm like, Lindsay would love to do it. She loves you. She would be so honored. He's like, will she take her clothes off? I said, yes. She told me she would take her clothes off. A week and a half later, 2 weeks later, I'm on a plane to LA. We figure out all the details. And this is Lindsay Lohan at the height of her fame. Paparazzi is following her all the time. Everything had to be so top secret. Adam knew about this project. The fashion editor knew about it. And maybe one other person knew, but nobody else in the magazine knew about it. We had to have labs sign NDAs. I flew to LA. We went to the original hotel room at the Bel Air where the shoot was originally done. We secured that room. I met Bert there. I'm very nervous because I'm just like, oh, will she take her clothes off? I just don't know. We get to the day of the shoot. Lindsay arrives on time. She arrives proudly. She's like, I'm here. I'm so excited. So nice to meet you. Kiss, kiss. And then she's like, I've been doing crunches. I feel ready to take my clothes off. And then Bert says to me, he's like, okay, Jody, Lindsay and I are going to go off into that room together. We had adjoining rooms, and I can't have other people in the room. I need her focused on me, and I need to make sure she feels comfortable. I said, absolutely. So after like 10 minutes of the shoot, he comes out. He's like, Jody. I'm like, what? He's like, she just took her top off. I'm like, okay, great. So I text Adam. She took her top off. Then Bert goes back into the room. He's shooting more pictures. Half an hour later, he comes over to me. He's like, she took her panties off. Texting Adam. She took her underwear off. She's naked. And Adam's in these manuscript meetings in his office. He's like, okay, the report, guys, not to leave this room, but Lindsay Lohan is officially nude and the pictures are really happening. And he shot most of the shoot on film, some of it on digital. Bert came to the office with tons of pictures, and he's 90 years old at this point, and he just threw them on the table, and there's lots of great stuff in here. You'll have fun editing. Let me know what you get and call me and just make sure I sign off on all of it. I'm like, absolutely.
Amazing. I'm going to pivot to something that's of interest, being a fellow photo editor. This is something that I've always found remarkable about your work at New York Magazine, because in addition to working with all the big name freelancers, you've had an incredible roster of in-house photographers during your tenure there. Hannah Whitaker, Danny Kim, Victor Prado, Bobby Doherty, Hugo Yu, and of course, Christopher Anderson. And we'll have links to all of them on our website as well. But their work has defined the look of the magazine as much as the freelancers. And I guess I have a couple of questions about that. I'm curious, was that your idea to have someone on staff? How does it work? Are they on salary? Are they on contract? And just, can you talk about the kind of energy that they bring to the mix of what you do with freelance work?
Yeah, Hannah Whitaker was the first one. That was born out of necessity, actually. We realized that there was a certain amount of still life photography that was built into the magazine in every single issue. And it seemed silly to be assigning it out to different photographers every time. And I went to Adam with this proposal. I did the math. And if we hired a staff photographer that was working with us 5 days a week, if we could find a studio in the office, that photographer can work out of, the benefit of me or another photo editor going in and out of that studio, collaborating with the photographer to get this voice right, it would be great. We could be doing still life together. We could be doing portraiture together. And there was no real need to be spending money on messengers, shipping product back and forth, and all of that stuff, and that we could do the whole thing in-house. And I thought very hard about what kind of a photographer we would want. And what's been consistent all the way through is I wanted photographers that were artists first and kind of commercial photographers second. So Hannah Whitaker was the first one, and that's exactly what she was. Like, she did some editorial photography, but she was really like a fine artist. And I really wanted somebody that thought like an artist and wasn't thinking about commercial and credits. That's the thing that I abhor so much. You can give that photographer a creative license, like liberties, and rethink how you shoot an apple. Because you don't have to shoot the apple with the watch and the necklace and the this, and no labels need to be showing you. We could just see the apple. Let's do the apple. What is the way to shoot an apple in a way that you've never seen an apple before? We now call that page the best in class, but it was called Best Bets. That first page that opens into the strategist. And that page, in terms of magazine making, is meant to be this like elegant, like visual relief after you've been through like a feature well with like heavier stories. It's supposed to be really reductive and simple. It's been great to work with all of these photographers and rethink, like, how do we shoot this and how do we shoot that? And how do we look at this shoe? How do we look at this roll of paper towels? Sometimes it's such a banal object. This week, for example, we have a picture of Neutrogena face cream. Tell me how to shoot that. We did it. I'll see it in Monday's issue. That's big joy of my job, is working very hands-on with these photographers to make these pictures.
You're working in fashion. The way you described how integrated your relationships have been with your editors and your art directors. You've worked with Janet Froelich. Since you've been in New York, you've worked with Luke Heyman, Chris Dixon, and now Tom Alberti. How do you think about your relationship with art directors?
The relationships are very close. They need to be. And everybody brings something different to the table. So Adam's genius, I think, is that he knew from the beginning that art directors, design directors excel at X, photo directors excel at Y. Let each do their best at their best potential, and then let that come together. So what's really great is that when I work with Tom, for instance, he's very involved in the conception of the photography, at least with covers and bigger, more conceptual stories. We work very well together, and we talk about the stories that are coming down the pipeline. And we conceptualize these things together. Nothing is done in a vacuum. We talk about what's the right tone for X story and Y story and what's the message we're trying to deliver. David Haskell is very involved in that, as was Adam at the time. And what do we think the headline is going to be? And Tom, in that sense, is going to be thinking about, oh, I think the feeling can be X and design can be Y. And I'm thinking about photography and I'm saying, oh, what do you guys think of this photographer or that photographer? What about this kind of voice? And Tom will weigh in, or if it was Luke, he would weigh in. But so it's very collaborative and that's great. Tom trusts that I can come to the table with a deeper, more connected knowledge of the photographic quotient of this. And I can trust that he'll come to the equation with more of a design sensibility, like the layout and how is that going to work? Or vis-a-vis the cover, like how is a picture going to translate with a headline? It's very collaborative. Making a magazine is very much like baking a cake. And you need all the ingredients to be working at their right proportions in order for this cake to rise and for it to work. And that's like what's happens here with the magazine. It's like everybody contributes what they know and what they do best. And together we can make this great product.
In a given week, how many covers are in the mix until you get to the final cover?
It really depends. We focus group every cover.
With the general public?
A mix of staff. We like having members of the staff that have no link to the cover story. We like to get like fresh perspective. So for instance, we might have one photo shoot and 4 different pictures, 4 different headlines. And so out of that, you get 20 different combinations, or it might be 4 different, very different ideas. And then we focus group those. But by that point, I feel like David, myself, Tom, we each have pretty good idea of what is probably not working, but we are often taken by surprise. Like sometimes we think, oh, we have a slam dunk here, and then we'll focus group it. And there's just a reaction to an image or language that perhaps we were too close to the story that we couldn't have necessarily predicted this reaction would. So we'll eliminate it. So those focus group meetings are very important.
A few years ago, New York was taken over by Vox, which is a big digital media company. Typically, you end up hearing nightmares about those kind of relationships when old media meets new media. What is your sense of Vox's strategy for print?
What I sense and what I've been told is that they are fully committed to print. And my everyday sense as I work here and the projects that we work on and the resources that have been made available to us as we work on these projects on our print products is that they're fully committed. It's been a fantastic merger. I couldn't have predicted such. I came from the New York Times Magazine. That was a different sort of animal. And then going to New York, we had resources, of course. We've always been very prudent and very cost efficient. But I also think cost efficiency, being prudent makes you better, makes you stronger, it makes you more creative. You think of alternative ways to solve things, which I think often makes for a better product. So I'm grateful for that. I do think that if you have too much money, you get lazy and you get fat. And that's not a good way to be.
And so they reduced your frequency. It certainly may have been a cost-cutting move, but it also is just an awareness of people's habits.
Habit. Yes. Yeah. I think we did that in 2015 around there. And it was terrifying at first going from a weekly to a bi-weekly. But I think we made a better magazine. It's just a more robust product. And I think that was the right call to make at that time. You didn't need the weekly magazine. People don't read magazines that way anymore. They just don't. And I think that was really smart at the time.
And it seems like the current design was driven by the same sort of reasons of people's patience, the amount of time they have, the way people read versus the internet. It all seems like a lesson for print magazines that haven't made it and how to survive. None of it seems desperate. It all seems thought out and strategic.
Yes, it's not as thought out as it probably seems, but I think there was a lot of thinking that went into it, and it was very strategic. And I think that we realized that it's a different readership. The web readership and print readership don't necessarily overlap. And now we're making many more enterprise stories, long form journalism. The web is not just breaking news here and snippets there. We do feature stories on the web. A lot of the stories that would go in the print magazine, but the print magazine can't necessarily print all of them because we only have so many pages. But the level of the piece is up to standards with classic magazine pieces. You can be a reader on the web and you can still experience all these great thought through, well edited pieces. And then that piece that may have been up online for a week and a half may show up in the print magazine 10 days later, and the reader won't necessarily overlap. And it's fine. So we can put up a piece online and also publish it in print. It doesn't matter.
Jody, you've been at New York Magazine for 20 years now, and I'm just curious how you've managed to keep it so cutting edge and fresh, especially those big franchise issues that you do, like Reasons to Love New York and others, year after year. How do you manage to do that?
It's not me, per se, at all. It's me and the whole magazine. I have to say that I think that what you're referring to, it's like moving with the news. So many of the projects that I think are so memorable are projects that are a result of a reaction to what's happening in our life at the time. Like the Reasons to Love New York cover that we did 2 years ago, where we had 72 famous New Yorkers crossing the intersection all at the same time. That was really an experiment that was a result of thinking, oh, we've been isolated from each other for so long. Wouldn't it be fun to do a cover where everybody's together on the street again? And then, David Haskell, he'll one-up me and he'll say, okay, but let's make it so that everybody's famous in that picture. So it's like one idea feeds another idea, which feeds another idea. And that's the beauty of working together. And then all of a sudden, we're embarking on this project where we're trying to get as many New Yorkers as we can to all gather on the Monday after Thanksgiving break to walk on the corner of Little West 12th Street and Washington and get this photographer who's going to shoot it and put it all together. It's like Hurricane Sandy. Like that cover would have never happened if the hurricane never happened. The Cosby issue wouldn't have happened if these women weren't coming forward and trying to tell their story. It's just leaning into the news around you and seeing where's your opportunity to make a magazine piece out of that. And that's what I'm grateful for. And that's really how it all comes together. I'm not particularly edgy. It's just more like, how do you translate what's happening into something really meaningful that you care about? And those are the pieces that make you excited to keep doing what you do. I often worry, am I dried up? Am I too old? Why don't I know who this singer is? And I'm about to do a cover with this person. But then you lean into it and you realize why. And then you're like, oh, then let's try it like this. And thank God I have a team of much younger photo editors around me, because they also help to keep me fresh. I constantly worry, like, when are they going to replace me? I worry about that all the time.
For more on this and all of our episodes, visit our website where, in addition to complete transcripts of all our interviews, along with portfolios, archival photos, links, and other great information on our guests, you'll find our blog, entry points, about all things magazine, and our ever-expanding swag shop with all kinds of great custom merch. You can also support the podcast by clicking the adorable yellow button at the top of the page, all available at magazium.co.
Print is Dead, Long Live Print is a member of the Hub and Spoke Audio Collective, a nonprofit association of audio storytellers dedicated to promoting and sustaining high-quality, independent podcasting. Learn more at hubspokeaudio.org.
Magazium is made possible by the generous support of listeners like you. If you love our shows and can't wait for new episodes, or even if you just listen from time to time and love knowing we're here, please consider making a donation to help keep us going. Visit magazium.co/support.
Print is Dead, Long Live Print is a production of Magazium, LLC. For more information, visit our website, magazium.co, or follow us on social media at magazium.co. Please give us a like and a review on your favorite podcast app. It really helps. Thanks very much for listening.